North Fort Hood sprawls across the vast, unforgiving wilderness of central Texas. Its 340 square miles, a stark contrast to the well-known, bustling Fort Hood base just south. But this remote training ground, known only to a few civilians, holds a history few have ever dared to uncover. Once a World War II subcamp, North Fort Hood housed tens of thousands of soldiers during the height of the war. By the 1990s, it was far quieter, left mostly untouched except for its role in specialized military training and equipment testing. The terrain is harsh, covered in dense forests of post oak and mesquite trees, with rare clearings where the remnants of old homesteads still stand. These old homes had been abandoned long ago when the army claimed the land, scattering families across the state. It's here, in this desolate wilderness, that our story begins. North Fort Hood's isolation and the mystery that lurks within it would become the setting for a chilling encounter that still echoes through the memories of the soldiers who survived it. For Sergeant Marcus Statera, it was supposed to be just another routine assignment. Simple, straightforward, and easy. At 21 years old, Statera, a soldier stationed at Fort Hood with an engineering unit, was used to the daily grind of military life. He had joined the army straight out of high school, looking for a way to gain more than what his small-town life in rural Oklahoma could offer. He wasn't a career soldier. Like many young men of his generation, he was driven by the promise of education benefits, not the expectation of long-term military service. So, when he was asked to guard some sensitive equipment out in North Fort Hood, a surveying system for artillery calculations, it seemed like the perfect job. All he needed to do was ensure the system stayed perfectly still while it underwent a week-long calibration. Simple, right? Little did he know this seemingly mundane task would pull him into a mystery he could never have imagined. On a Thursday evening in early May, Sergeant Statera and his companion, Private First Class David Griffin, were dropped off at their remote assignment in North Fort Hood. The Humvee carrying them disappeared down the dirt road, leaving them alone in the wilderness with their equipment and supplies. Their mission was simple: watch over the surveying equipment, ensure its calibration went smoothly, and wait for the technicians to return in a few days. With plenty of food and basic shelter in the form of a worn-out canvas tent, the two soldiers were ready for what they thought would be an easy, uneventful few days. They had no vehicle, no communication with the outside world, and no backup in case something went wrong. It was 1992, and cell phones were still a rarity, so if anything happened, they were completely on their own. The site itself, though seemingly innocuous, held an eerie quality. It was situated next to an old airstrip used for helicopter training, surrounded by thick forests. The surveying equipment, sitting on a concrete pad, looked out of place against the backdrop of overgrown trees and dense underbrush. The soldiers couldn't have known then, but this quiet, isolated corner of the base would soon become the scene of something they would never forget. As evening descended, the weather began to change. The sky darkened and thunder rumbled in the distance. In central Texas, thunderstorms can develop rapidly, and that evening was no exception. Statera later recalled the sight of black storm clouds rolling across the horizon, accompanied by the sharp smell of ozone that precedes an electrical storm. The winds began to pick up, and soon the first heavy raindrops began to fall. With the tent now no match for the approaching storm, the soldiers retreated to the metal shelter mounted on the back of the military truck. It was a precautionary move, as military regulations were clear. In severe weather, always seek substantial shelter and never abandon your post. The storm intensified quickly, transforming the calm evening into what Texans call a frog strangler, an intense thunderstorm that dumps torrential rain in a very short period. Lightning illuminated the landscape, flashing starkly against the black sky, and thunder roared as if the earth itself were shaking. But through it all, their tent somehow survived. Both Statera and Griffin were amazed that it didn't collapse under the weight of the storm. It was a night that would soon take a turn toward the strange, though neither soldier could have known that yet. The next few hours would mark the beginning of an inexplicable and terrifying encounter. By 10 p.m., the storm had passed, leaving behind the cool, clean smell of wet earth that follows a heavy rain. The air was calm once again, and the soldiers, after ensuring that their tent hadn't been damaged beyond repair, settled into their shelter for the night. Griffin took the first watch, while Statera tried to get some rest. The night was silent, save for the occasional drip of water from the trees and the soft sounds of the wind. Statera had barely drifted into a light sleep when something suddenly jolted him awake. He felt the violent shaking of the shelter, Startled, he looked over to see Griffin, wide-eyed and trembling, struggling to lock the shelter door. His hands were shaking so violently that he could barely manage the simple task of securing the door. Something was wrong. As the green glow from Griffin's military watch illuminated his face, Statera could see that his friend was terrified. His face was a mask of pure fear, his body rigid with tension, and his eyes filled with panic. There was no way this was just a prank. Griffin was genuinely scared. His hands, slick with sweat, fumbled with the door's lock, and Statera could see the terror in his eyes. Then, in a whisper that barely broke the silence, Griffin spoke, his voice strained with fear. "Something grabbed my foot. It tried to pull me out of here. It spoke to me. It said it'd be back for me." At first, Statera thought Griffin was just playing a prank, that the isolation and the recent storm had rattled his nerves. But the fear in Griffin's eyes, the trembling of his hands, and the panic that was evident in every movement told a different story. This wasn't a joke. It was real. As the senior soldier, Statera instinctively took charge, trying to calm Griffin down and get him to focus. He explained the importance of ventilation to avoid suffocation, moved him away from the door, and positioned himself near the entrance. If something was outside, Statera would be the one to face it. Though the situation was rapidly becoming surreal, Statera's training kicked in. He had to stay calm, stay focused. Whatever it was that had frightened Griffin so much, he had to make sure they were prepared to face it. Little did he know, the real terror had only just begun. As the minutes passed, the shelter grew still again. The only sounds were the occasional drip of rainwater from the trees, now heavy with moisture. Griffin had managed to calm down, though his hands still trembled, and his breathing was shallow. Statera, on the other hand, remained alert, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the shelter. His senses were heightened. Every rustle in the wind, every creak of the trees, every snap of a twig was now a potential threat. He knew that it was easy to let the mind wander in situations like this, easy to let fear take hold, but something deep in his gut told him that there was more to this than just nerves. The scratching began quietly at first, barely audible over the wind's soft moan. Statera froze, his blood turning cold as he listened. It wasn't the random sound of an animal searching for food, or the movement of wind against the shelter. It was purposeful, methodical. The sound seemed to move along the sides of the shelter, slow and deliberate, as if something was examining their refuge, something that was deliberately testing the barriers between them and the outside world. The scratching stopped for a moment, but only for a brief while. The silence was heavy, suffocating, and Statera found himself holding his breath, waiting for the next noise. And then it started again, scratching, moving from one area to another, as if something, or someone, was probing the shelter from every angle. It wasn't the kind of sound that animals made. No raccoon or possum would move in this way, systematically working its way around a structure, testing it, seeing how vulnerable it was. It wasn't just a random animal encounter, it was something else entirely. The scratching continued off and on, like a persistent presence circling them, examining them, waiting. The longer it went on, the more Statera began to feel the weight of something he couldn't fully explain. He didn't want to acknowledge it, but he couldn't ignore the growing feeling that something was out there, something intelligent, something that had a purpose. Every so often the door of the shelter would move slightly, not from the wind or the storm, but from controlled pressure, like something was testing its strength, seeing how far it could push before the door would give way. The men lay there in the dark, on edge, gripping anything they could use as weapons, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Neither of them spoke. They couldn't. The fear was so palpable that every noise seemed to bring them closer to the edge of their nerves snapping. As the hours dragged on, they both held their breath each time the scratching stopped, waiting in the silence for the next round of testing. But it always came back. Relentless, purposeful. Neither man knew what was out there, but they were both certain of one thing. Whatever it wasn't leaving them alone tonight. The night stretched on, each minute feeling like an eternity. The scratching, the pressure against the door, these sounds were relentless, each one gnawing at their already frayed nerves. Statera couldn't tell how long they had been lying there in the dark, listening, waiting for the next move, but the worst part was the silence that followed every round of scratching, that stillness that stretched long enough to make them wonder if whatever was out there had gone away. Had they imagined it all? Could it be some natural phenomenon, some trick of the wind or the storm playing with their minds? Statera didn't believe that for a second. The noises were too deliberate, too focused. Something was out there, something that wasn't just trying to frighten them, it was testing them, trying to gauge their reaction. And then, as the wind howled outside, came the sound they had been dreading. The door, pressed with some unseen force, moved. It wasn't the wind pushing against the door, it wasn't a gust of air, it was a slow, methodical push, as if someone or something was leaning against it, testing how far it would give. The door shifted slightly. Statera's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a random occurrence. This was something deliberate, something with intent. Whatever was outside had found a new way to test them. First the scratching, now this. Something wanted to get inside. The hairs on the back of Statera's neck stood up, and his grip tightened around the makeshift weapon he had been clutching. This wasn't just fear. This was survival. They had to hold their ground. Griffin was still shaking, his breath shallow, his eyes wide. He had seen the door move too. There was no denying it now. They were not alone. Statera could feel his heart pounding in his chest as the pressure against the door continued. Each time the door moved, it was as if time slowed, each second dragging on longer than the last. The fear was thick in the air, and every sound felt amplified. Statera's mind raced, trying to process the situation. What the hell was out there, and why were they being targeted? Every part of his military training told him to remain calm, to think through their options, but the raw terror creeping into his bones made it hard to focus. He couldn't deny it any longer. There was something out there, something not of this world. A scrape along the side of the shelter broke through his thoughts, followed by the pressure on the door again. Whatever it was determined to find a way in. They had to act. But every part of Statera's instincts screamed to wait, to stay as quiet as possible, and hope whatever it was would lose interest and move on. There was nothing they could do, no backup, no way to communicate, and no certainty that they'd make it out alive. The minutes stretched into an hour, then two, but the scratching never stopped. The pressure on the door never relented. Whatever was out there knew they were inside, and as dawn approached, the two soldiers lay there, hearts racing, desperately trying to hold on to their sanity. As dawn finally broke, the light filtering through the storm clouds felt surreal. The scratching, the incessant testing of the shelter's boundaries had stopped. The pressure against the door had vanished. Statera lay there, still, holding his breath, waiting for the next sound to emerge from the silence. But nothing came. It was as if the night had dissolved into a haunting memory, and the world outside was nothing like the terror they had endured. Statera's first instinct was to wait longer, to make sure they were truly safe. The air was thick with anticipation, the fear still hanging heavily between him and Griffin, who lay across the shelter, still wide-eyed, still trembling. But as the first rays of light broke across the landscape, Statera finally made the decision. He had to open the door. They had to see what was out there. Cautiously, he inched toward the door, his pulse quickening with every movement. Every part of him screamed to keep the door shut, to stay hidden in the relative safety of their shelter. But he couldn't ignore it. They had to know. They had to face whatever was out there. Statera stood up and, with a final glance at Griffin, pushed open the door. He stepped out into the light, bracing himself for whatever he might find. His eyes immediately scanned the ground. There was nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone or anything being near the shelter. The muddy ground from the previous night's storm was still visible, with their own boot prints clearly marked in the earth. But there was no sign of anything else. No animal tracks, no human footprints, nothing to suggest that any creature had been near their shelter in the last several hours. The eerie silence that greeted him made the fear creep back in, deeper now, gnawing at the edges of his mind. The scratching, the pressure on the door, they had both heard it so clearly. The terror in Griffin's eyes had been real, but now, standing in the early morning light, nothing seemed out of place. Statera's mind struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. How could there be no trace of what had caused that relentless, deliberate scratching? How could there be no sign of the thing that had so carefully, so methodically tested their defenses? He scanned the area one more time, his eyes moving over every inch of the surrounding land. Nothing. He turned to Griffin, who had followed him outside, but the younger man looked as lost as he felt. Both soldiers stood there in a daze, their minds too rattled to process what they had just survived. The question lingered between them, unspoken for a long time. What had really happened? Had they imagined it? Or had something been out there? Statera tried to shake the thought from his head. He wanted to be sure it was over, that the nightmare had passed, but deep down he knew the truth. Something had happened. Something that neither of them could explain. They couldn't just forget about it. As they packed up their gear and waited for their ride to arrive, the weight of the unknown hung over them. They both felt it, but it was something neither of them could speak about. Not yet, not now. As the sun climbed higher, the chill of the early morning slowly dissipated, but the unease still clung to Statera and Griffin. There was an unsettling quiet to the landscape now, almost too quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Statera tried to focus on the task at hand, gathering their gear, preparing for their ride, but his mind kept drifting back to the night. What had really happened? He replayed the events in his head, trying to piece together what they had experienced. The scratching, the pressure against the door, the complete absence of any footprints or tracks outside, it didn't make sense. The rational part of his mind told him that they had been caught in the grip of fear, that the isolation and the storm had played tricks on them. But deep down he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, something far beyond what his training or his understanding could explain. Griffin, too, had fallen into a strange silence. The young soldier, who had always been talkative, was now withdrawn, lost in his own thoughts. Statera noticed the way Griffin's eyes darted around the clearing, as if expecting something to emerge from the trees. The terror from the night before had clearly not left him, despite the apparent calm of the morning. They both knew something had happened, but neither of them wanted to put it into words. That would make it real. Instead, they silently went about their tasks, packing up their equipment with an urgency that neither of them could explain. Their nerves were on edge, their movements sharp and quick. They both wanted to leave, to get away from the isolation of the site. But more than that, they wanted to avoid any confrontation with whatever it was that had been out there. By the time their ride arrived, Statera was almost relieved. The familiar rumble of the Humvee's engine felt like a lifeline, but as the vehicle came into view, something else, something more unsettling, began to settle in. The sound of the engine seemed to break the spell of silence. Yet, it felt almost out of place, like a discordant note in an otherwise eerie symphony. They climbed into the vehicle, their gear secured, and the engine roared to life. The Humvee's tires crushed the dirt road beneath them as they made their way back to the main base, but the sense of unease lingered. As the vehicle sped away from the clearing, Statera's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. His gaze lingered on the landscape behind them, scanning the area one last time, but there was nothing. Just the empty wilderness. Still, the nagging thought remained. Whatever had happened out there, whatever had tormented them in the darkness, wasn't finished. It wasn't over. The ride back to base was mostly silent. The only sounds were the hum of the Humvee's engine and the occasional radio chatter, but neither soldier spoke much. Griffin's face was pale, his eyes fixed out the window, his jaw set in a tight line. Statera could feel the tension in the air, could sense the weight of what had happened, but he wasn't sure how to address it. He wasn't sure if he even wanted to. All he knew was that they had both survived something that, in a way, neither of them fully understood. They had made it out, but the knowledge that something had been out there, something they couldn't explain, stayed with them. It followed them like a shadow, lingering just out of sight, just beyond their understanding. As the Humvee drew closer to base, the oppressive silence was finally broken by Griffin's voice, quiet but firm. "We're not talking about this, are we?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Statera glanced at him, saw the look in his eyes, and nodded slowly. He didn't know what to say. They had both experienced something beyond their comprehension, something that couldn't be explained away with logic or reason. Whatever it was, whatever it had been, it wasn't something they were ready to speak of. Not yet. The first thing that struck Statera as they pulled up to the base was the sudden contrast between the oppressive wilderness and the bustling hub of military activity. The sounds of the Humvee's engine faded as they entered the base, replaced by the noise of vehicles, soldiers, and the usual chaotic hum of military life. But for Statera, it felt almost jarring. The base, with its strict rules and daily routines, was a far cry from the isolation and fear they had just left behind. The feeling of unease still clung to him, and even the familiar surroundings of the base couldn't shake the lingering dread that had settled into his bones. Griffin, too, seemed distracted, his eyes darting nervously around as they drove through the base's gates. He wasn't speaking now. His silence spoke volumes. When they finally parked and unloaded their gear, there was a palpable tension between the two soldiers. Neither of them could look each other in the eye for long, as if acknowledging what had happened would make it all the more real. The unspoken agreement between them was simple: move on, pretend nothing had happened. There was no room for fear or doubt in the military, and certainly no room for supernatural occurrences. But as the days passed, Statera couldn't rid himself of the feeling that something had followed them back to the base. The strange silence in the woods, the scratching on the shelter, the way Griffin had reacted, it all felt like an imprint on his mind that wouldn't fade. He had seen fear before, but nothing like that. Not this raw, unrestrained panic. It was as though something had reached into Griffin's very soul, twisting it with an unknown terror. He couldn't shake the image of Griffin's eyes, the terror in them, the way his hands had shaken uncontrollably. As the week wore on, Statera found himself increasingly distracted. His training, the very foundation of his military life, seemed to slip away with every passing day. He went through the motions, completing tasks, attending briefings, but his mind was always elsewhere, haunted by what had happened in that remote corner of North Fort Hood. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind outside made him jump. He started having trouble sleeping, his nights filled with restless tossing and turning. He would wake up, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, as though he had been reliving the events of that night. He knew it was starting to affect his performance, but he couldn't stop it. The fear, the uncertainty, it gnawed at him, and there was no one he could talk to about it. Not without risking being branded a coward, a man who had been scared by something he couldn't even explain. As he walked through the base, he couldn't shake the feeling that everyone around him was watching, waiting for him to break. The pressure, the weight of keeping such an experience locked away, it was becoming unbearable. Griffin wasn't doing any better. Though he had returned to his usual duties, his demeanor had changed. He was quieter, more distant, and seemed unnerved by even the smallest sounds. Statera knew his friend was hiding something. He could see it in his eyes, the same fear that had consumed him on the night of the storm. But Griffin was just like him, unwilling to speak, unwilling to confront what they had both experienced. Instead, they both lived in the silence of unspoken terror, trying to continue with their lives as though nothing had happened. One afternoon, as Statera stood in the mess hall, his eyes scanning the crowd of soldiers, he caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of his eye, a figure standing at the far end of the room. It was a fleeting image, gone as soon as he looked up, but something about it stopped him dead in his tracks. For a brief moment he could have sworn he saw the same figure that had been standing on the peak of the shelter that night. The same humanoid shape, the same glowing eyes. His heart skipped a beat, and he immediately looked away, trying to convince himself it was nothing. But the feeling lingered, gnawing at him. He pushed it aside, determined not to let it consume him. But as the days passed, he found himself looking over his shoulder more often, checking the shadows and listening to the smallest sounds. He couldn't help it. Something wasn't right. He didn't know if it was the memories of that night haunting him, or if there was something more to it. Either way, he knew one thing for sure. The events of that night weren't over, not by a long shot. They had followed him back, and he was beginning to fear they would never let him go. Statera couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The sensation clung to him every waking moment, a constant presence in the back of his mind. It wasn't the kind of paranoia one might expect from a soldier returning from a harrowing experience. It was different. This was something visceral, almost primal. He would catch glimpses of shadows moving just outside his peripheral vision, or hear faint sounds when he was alone in his quarters, sounds that couldn't be explained. At first he tried to brush it off. The mind plays tricks on you after a traumatic event, right? The isolation, the exhaustion, those things could cause hallucinations. But the more he tried to dismiss it, the more intense it became. The feeling of being watched became overwhelming, and no matter where he went, the eerie sense of being followed lingered like an oppressive cloud. It wasn't just Statera. Griffin, too, had been acting strange. He had started to withdraw, his once jovial personality replaced by a grim quietness that was unnerving to anyone who spoke to him. He was still doing his duties, but he wasn't the same. The lightness in his voice was gone, replaced by a harsh, haunted edge. Whenever Statera tried to talk to him, Griffin would shift uncomfortably, his eyes darting as if he were looking for an escape. It was as though he was physically present, but his mind was somewhere else, somewhere dark. As the days turned into weeks, the tension only deepened. Statera found himself losing focus at work, distracted by the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. He spent more time than usual alone, wandering the base late at night, hoping that the solitude would calm his racing thoughts, but it never did. One night, As he walked through the barracks, he overheard a conversation between two other soldiers. They were speaking in hushed tones, but the words still cut through the quiet air like a blade. "Did you hear about the guys who went up to North Fort Hood last month?" one of them asked. "I heard they didn't come back the same. Weird things were happening up there, they say." The other soldier, clearly nervous, whispered back, "I've heard stories. People who've been out there, well, they won't talk about it. They just won't." Statera froze, his breath caught in his throat. The stories, the rumors. He had heard whispers of the strange things that happened up there, but he had always chalked it up to exaggerated tales or the result of too many sleepless nights in the field. But now, listening to these soldiers speak, something in their voices made him think there was more to it than that. His heart pounded in his chest as he continued to listen. The stories were everywhere, buried under layers of gossip and speculation, but no one would ever dare to speak openly about it. It wasn't just the soldiers who had been affected. The entire base felt different, as if some dark energy had taken root. Statera began to wonder if the things they had encountered up in North Fort Hood weren't just a figment of their imaginations. Maybe they weren't alone after all. Maybe the thing that had been with them in the woods, the thing that had followed them, was still out there, watching, waiting. The next few days passed in a blur, but the unease only grew stronger. Statera couldn't shake the feeling that he was caught in some kind of limbo, unable to escape the lingering effects of what he had experienced. He started to wonder if it would ever end. Would he ever be able to put that night behind him? Would he ever be free of the feeling of being hunted? One night, unable to sleep, he found himself standing in front of the window in his quarters, staring out at the darkened landscape. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the moonlight cast long shadows across the ground. In that moment, he was struck by a chilling thought. What if the feeling of being watched, the constant dread, wasn't a product of his mind? What if it was real? What if something had followed them back to the base and was waiting for the right moment to strike? The thought sent a wave of cold terror through him, and for the first time since returning from the wilderness, Statera realized the truth. There was no escaping it. What they had encountered wasn't over. It was only just beginning, and it wasn't going to let them go. The morning after his restless night, Statera knew something had changed. There was a heaviness in the air, as if the world around him had shifted, settling into an unsettling stillness. The other soldiers moved about the base in their usual routines, but Statera could sense the undercurrent of tension that had begun to grip them all. It wasn't just him. It was as if the entire unit was on edge, an unspoken dread hanging over everyone. As he went through his daily duties, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the edges of his perception. Something was watching. He found himself drawn to the edges of the base, to the areas that were off limits. Places where the darkness seemed to consume everything, where the light never reached. It was in these shadows that he felt it most, the undeniable presence of something that didn't belong. His instincts screamed at him to run, to get out, to escape whatever dark force was creeping up behind him, but he couldn't. The pull was too strong. It was as if he had no choice but to confront whatever was waiting. It wasn't long before Statera found himself at the outskirts of North Fort Hood once again, standing at the edge of the same wilderness that had nearly broken him. He could feel it now, the weight of the silence pressing down on him, the heavy, unnatural stillness that hung in the air. The forest stretched out before him, dense and foreboding, but he wasn't afraid, at least not in the same way he had been before. This time, it was different. He was ready. He had to be. The night of terror that had followed them, the scratching sounds, the haunting presence, it had all led him here. The soldiers who had survived this place, the ones who spoke in hushed tones and refused to meet his eyes, they had all been right. There was something out there, something that the army had tried to bury, something they couldn't explain. Statera knew that he needed to face it head-on, once and for all. As he ventured deeper into the forest, the air grew colder, the shadows darker. It was as though the trees themselves were closing in around him, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted hands, eager to ensnare him. But he didn't turn back. Not this time. He moved forward, one step at a time, until he came to a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a single figure, silhouetted against the dark sky. It was impossible to tell if it was human or something else entirely, but there was no mistaking the intensity of its presence. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, waiting. Statera's heart pounded in his chest as he raised his weapon. His breath was ragged, his body tense, but he didn't hesitate. The time for fear had passed. In that moment, time seemed to stretch, to slow. The world around him fell away as he locked eyes with the figure in the clearing. And then, as if sensing his resolve, the figure stepped forward, breaking the silence. Its movements were fluid, unnatural, as if it wasn't quite tethered to reality. The air seemed to shimmer around it, distorting, like a mirage. And then it spoke, not in words, but in a voice that reverberated through his mind, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from the very earth itself. "You shouldn't have come here." The words were simple, but their weight was crushing. It was a warning, but also a statement of inevitability. Statera didn't reply. He couldn't. His mind was racing, his body frozen. What was this thing? What had it been waiting for? Before he could process what was happening, the creature lunged faster than he could react, its grotesque form blurring in and out of focus. It was no longer a figure. It was a force, a manifestation of all the nightmares he had ever known. And then everything went black. When Statera came to, he was back at the base, lying in his cot, the weight of the world pressing down on him. Had it all been a dream? No, he knew it hadn't. The terror, the feeling of being hunted, it was all real. He had come face to face with whatever had haunted him in the wilderness, whatever had followed him back. But what happened in that clearing? What was the creature, and why had it allowed him to leave? He didn't have the answers. But what he did know was that he could never forget. That night, that encounter, it had changed him forever. Some things he realized were never meant to be understood. Some things were simply beyond explanation. And North Fort Hood, its dark corners, its secrets, would remain a part of him for the rest of his life. He would never truly escape it.